Justice of the House, Lord Kennedy of Southwark, on behalf of Privy Seal.
My Lords, on behalf of my noble friend, the Lord Privy Seal, I beg to move the motion standing in her name on the order paper. In doing so, I thought it would be helpful for noble Lords if I set out how proceedings will work today. As the House will know, the House of Commons is currently considering the Steel Industry Special Measures Bill. Whilst this is happening, our House will have a general take-note debate led by my noble friend Baroness Jones of Whitchurch. This is intended to form the substantive debate on the bill ahead of a formal second reading when the bill reaches our House. There are 27 noble Lords signed up to speak with an advisory backbench contribution of 5 minutes. This is designed to balance the importance of scrutiny with concluding our proceedings at a reasonable hour. So when the clock reaches 4 minutes, backbench speakers should begin to make their concluding remarks, and at 5 minutes the time is up. If the bill arrives from the Commons during the take-note debate, we will briefly adjourn for the debate to give the bill a first reading. This allows the bill to be printed and means noble Lords can then approach the Public Bill Office to table amendments. Once the debate has concluded, we will have a formal second reading and adjourn for an hour to allow noble Lords to table amendments for committee stage. The precise timings for amendments will be announced in the House and advertised on the Annunciator. Today's list will then be reissued with the groupings of any amendments for committee stage debates. Once the committee stage has concluded, and if no amendments have been made, we will then proceed to a formal report stage and third reading. If the bill is delayed in the Commons for any reason, some of these arrangements will change, and the Whips and I will update the House at a suitable point. The House will rise once the bill has received royal assent. Finally, my Lords, I would like just to thank all our colleagues working for the House who have come in on a Saturday during the Easter break to allow the House to sit at short notice. The police and security staff for keeping everyone on the parliamentary estate safe. The House officials, the library staff, the government whips and leaders' office staff, special advisers and opposition, Liberal Democrat and conveners' office staff. Blackrod and her team, the doorkeepers, along with the catering staff in the River Restaurant and the Long Room. I am very grateful for their dedication and support. I also want to place on record my thanks to the usual channels for the helpful and positive engagement yesterday. I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as of that opinion will say content. The contrary not content. The contents have it. Motion for debate, the Steel Industry Special Measures Bill, Baroness Jones of Whitchurch.
My Lords, I beg to move the motion standing in my name on the order paper. My Lords, this House has reconvened under exceptional circumstances which merit an exceptional response from the Government. Our request to recall Parliament was not one that we made lightly, and I'm grateful to noble Lords on all sides of the House for being here today as the Government seeks to pass this emergency legislation. This legislation allows the Government to take control of British Steel's blast furnaces, maintaining steel production and, by extension, protecting the company's 3,500-strong workforce. And I want to reassure noble Lords that given the exceptional nature of a recall, the Government thought it better to limit the powers in this bill, which are still significant, rather than introduce more complex matters of property rights and public ownership at the same time. This is not about nationalisation. We are keeping all options under review, and we will of course return to Parliament for further scrutiny should the need arise. Now, as noble Lords will know, since taking office, the Government have been negotiating in good faith with British Steel's owners, Jinjay. We have sought to prevent the early closure of the 2 blast furnaces at the company's Scunthorpe site, which Jinjay have claimed are no longer financially viable. We worked tirelessly to find a way forward, making a generous offer of support to British Steel with sensible, common sense conditions to protect the workforce, protect UK taxpayers, and to create a commercially viable company for the future. Zheng refusal to accept the deal on the table and to accelerate the closure of the blast furnaces at Scunthorpe has left us with no other choice. We must now take control of the company's blast furnaces. Because let there be no doubt, this government will never hesitate to take action to protect this nation's assets. We will not abandon the hard-working steel-making communities that have given so much to both our economy and to our country. And where vital industries are on the verge of collapse or where communities face devastation, we will always act in the national interest. We do not accept the argument that steelmaking has no future in the UK. As the Prime Minister asserted yesterday, our plan for change means that domestic demand for steel is only set to go up, not down. In the last few weeks alone, we've seen Heathrow Airport announce multi-billion pound expansion plans requiring 400,000 tonnes of new steel. We've seen Universal Studios confirm that it will be building Europe's biggest theme park, and where possible, it will be using UK-made steel to make it. We need British Steel for this and for our critical infrastructure projects, from rail to renewable energy. We need it to keep Britain secure at home and strong abroad. The legislation we're setting out today will also help end the uncertainty that's been hanging over British Steel's Scunthorpe site for far too long. We know that rebuilding our steel industry brings a fair share of challenges, but they're challenges that we believe are worth facing, challenges that we are more than prepared to overcome. It's why we agreed a new deal with better protections for workers at Port Talbot within weeks of taking office, which will transform production and deliver a modern electric arc furnace. It's why we've delivered measures as part of the British Industry Supercharger to cut electricity costs for steel firms and bring prices more in line with international competitors. It's why we've simplified public procurement, aligning it with our industrial strategy that is putting UK firms, including those within the steel industry, in the best possible position to bid for and to win public contracts. It's why we've launched a consultation on our steel strategy, part of an effort to work with industry on overcoming the difficult issues such as high electricity costs and unfair trading practices so that we can protect the UK's industrial heartlands. And it's why today we've taken the decision to safeguard British steel, because Britain is a steel-making country. Steel-making has been fundamental to Britain's industrial strength, our security, and our identity as a global power. Today's legislation will help ensure that we can retain that steel-making capacity here in the UK, both now and for many years to come. And I urge the House to support it. I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
My Lords, I'd just like to start off by echoing the words of the Government Chief Whip. Just taking a moment to thank all the staff of Parliament for their tremendous efforts in facilitating this recall today. It is no small task to bring us all together at short notice, and their dedication to the democratic process is deserving of recognition. What this debate is about at its heart is whether we have a steel sector in this country at all, and whether it is run in the national interest. Earlier today, the government confirmed that it will take control of British Steel following the collapse of negotiations with its Chinese owners. This is a pivotal moment, not just for the future of British steelmaking, but for the future of Britain's industrial base itself. Before I go any further, may I just say, our thoughts today must be with the steelworkers, their families, their suppliers, the communities whose futures now hang in the balance. They deserve better than uncertainty and neglect, and they must certainly have a government that is on their side. Well, my lords, this is the first time Parliament has been recalled to sit on a Saturday since I was sitting in the other place in 1982 after the Falklands War began. It's only the 6th occasion since the end of the Second World War. And for a bill published just 2 hours ago, no respect for Parliament whatsoever. I really must say, this is not the way to treat this precious institution. Now, on the bill itself, it grants such far-reaching powers to the Secretary of State. Now, the government will argue that this is necessary because of the emergency we face. However, just now in the other place, the Secretary of State said this, and I quote, "I don't want these powers a minute more than necessary." So where is the sunset clause in this bill? How can we be assured that these extraordinary powers will not be abused or extended indefinitely? The government has to make clear the precise time frame for these powers, and more importantly, they must demonstrate how they intend to ensure that public and Parliament are not left in the dark once this emergency has passed. My lords, the choice before ministers should never have become this stark. Faced with the collapse of British Steel, the government had little option but to intervene. Well, let's be clear, nationalisation is not a triumph, it's a last resort made necessary by failure. Without it, Britain would indeed have become the only G7 country without primary steel-making capacity. However, my lords, today's events are not simply the result of forces beyond the government's control. The truth is this: nationalisation must be a platform for urgent and permanent modernisation, not a short-term bailout or a delaying tactic. And without decisive action, Britain's steel industry will wither under the combined pressures of global competition, green regulation and technological change. My lords, I believe it is essential that we consider the effect and the impact of green targets which have placed immense strain on our industries. The policies driving us towards net zero by 2050 have hit our industries hard, especially energy-intensive sectors like steel. Energy costs in the UK are now the highest in Europe, and 4 times that in the United States. And the current trajectory of green regulation is making it harder, not easier, for our industries to compete internationally. My lords, we just need to ensure that our environmental goals do not come at the cost of our industrial base. The government must urgently review its net zero policies to ensure that they support, not strangle, British industry. If we don't strike the right balance, we will continue to see industries like steel driven offshore, taking not only jobs and investment with them, but also the very emission targets we champion. We cannot allow this to happen. And my lords, let's just remember, just a few months ago, Ed Miliband banned coal and coke production in the UK, boasting about sending a signal to the world. Yet today, as we heard in the other place, the government are going round the world with a begging bowl, trying to find enough coal to keep the last blast furnaces running. Could British steel survive today if access to coal wasn't artificially restricted? Possibly. But we're in the mess we're in because decisions like this have been made in pursuit of political point scoring, I suppose, by this government, with no thought for the long-term health of our core industries. But, my lords, how is it possible that no one in the government saw this crisis coming? How could they have been so unprepared? The warning signs have been flashing for months. Ageing infrastructure, soaring energy prices, and growing global competition. We debated in this chamber just a short time ago the way in which there had been no serious contingency planning, as yet no coherent industrial strategy, and certainly no sense of urgency. Instead, the government are now scrambling to nationalise British Steel as a last resort. That's not leadership, my lords. It's crisis management at its worst. Now, on the 31st of March, the Noble Baroness, the Minister, stated that we will be producing a steel strategy very soon. Well, my lords, following the events of the last 24 hours, and now that the government has found time to lay an emergency bill, it's surely time for them to publish an emergency steel strategy as well. Where is it? The Minister, the Secretary of State in the other place, just referred to quotations from the steel strategy. So it must exist in draft, should not this House be given a copy. Steel workers, their families and the taxpayer need more than vague assurances. They need clear timelines. So when will this strategy be published? Will it commit to the urgent modernisation our steel sector desperately needs? Will it address the crippling energy costs faced by our steelmakers? And will it set a clear and credible path to return British Steel to private ownership? My lords, we have to learn from industry. The last time steel was nationalised, back in the 1960s, the results were disastrous. And I quote from Hansard: grants and loans to the British Steel Corporation between 67 and 31st March 1980 total £4,925 million. The net total loss for BSC since 1967 is £1,552 million. Rather than revitalising the industry, nationalisation led to bureaucratic inefficiencies, losses, a decline in productivity, and widespread industrial action. My lords, the government's approach to the steel sector is compounded by the broader challenges it faces, and it is imposing on employers right across the country. The government increased employers' national insurance contributions. They're rushing through the unemployment bill that in its current form will add further strain to the already fragile labour market. It's difficult to see how these measures align with any credible strategy to attract private investment. Surely, the Noble Baroness, the Minister, must acknowledge that their policies have made it more difficult for the investment the steel industry so desperately needs. If they are serious about a future where British steel is returned to private hands, they must urgently reconsider their policies. We agree that uncertainty has to end. So will the government confirm today that should nationalisation be pursued, it will only be a temporary measure? Will they now set out clearly what the timeline for that transition to private ownership will be? We can't afford again to hear the standard vagueness of all options are on the table. This doesn't provide the certainty that workers who deserve clarity about their future need. It does not provide certainty for the taxpayer who are now footing the bill. Which brings me to my final point. Can the Noble Baroness, the Minister, tell us today what estimate they have reached of the cost of nationalisation to the taxpayer? My lords, this is not leadership, this is not planning, This is a crisis, and one that should never have been allowed to happen in the first place.
My Lords, I also from these benches want to thank all the staff who have come in today. We are very grateful to them, not just for giving their time, but also taking care under the special circumstances which have complicated today. My Lords, the very urgent and serious position that this country now faces means that emergency action must be taken, and it makes complete sense to recall both Houses of Parliament. But this must be the start of a serious plan for the sustainable future of domestic steel production. The circumstances of the need for these measures have been known for some time, and it's clear from the diplomatic language of government statements in the last 48 hours that the word forthright, when used in the context of government negotiations with the Chinese company Jingye, is doing a great deal of heavy lifting. So it is good that the Minister has outlined some of that detail this morning. It explains the nature of the urgent crisis. But it is worth noting that this isn't a recent problem, not even a few months, as just suggested by Lord Hunt of Wirral. Ever since privatisation, which from these benches we do not oppose in principle, nor, by the way, my Lords, are we against nationalisation as a last resort, there has been a disregard for the impact of the repeated change of ownership of our state infrastructure companies. That may have been less important at the time, but other changes in global manufacturing and trading patterns should have been a warning signal, especially to past Conservative governments. And to Lord Hunt of Wirral, I say, it is worth reminding ourselves that a past Conservative government sold British Steel for £1. Then the consequences of the extra trade barriers as a result of Brexit, scrapping the Industry Strategy Council and allowing the sale of steel plant to a Chinese firm, which it is now clear is not negotiating in good faith. The entry of foreign state-owned enterprise into the British economy and infrastructure means that a number of other governments now own all or part of key UK infrastructure, sometimes leaving us vulnerable. And in today's Financial Times, Ewan Gibbs says, the UK is an outlier in Europe where the state still often owns important industries. President Trump's tariff wars mean that all other nations are now reviewing their ability to maintain their own infrastructure in the light of tariffs. And this government is also right to do so at a time when our steel industry is already in crisis. We start from a weaker position than those countries because we don't own our own infrastructure. And as we increase defence spending for the existential threats facing the UK, Europe and, of course, Ukraine, can the Minister say, is the threat of the Chinese company removing manufacturing back to China acceptable? And is that not a clear security threat? Before I turn to the bill, which it's really important to focus on the broader issue of the possible closure of the Scunthorpe Works. This government promised that it would deliver on the promises made by the previous Conservative government, which were woefully under-delivered to strengthen communities in the north of England. And the Scunthorpe community, like many other steel communities, like Port Talbot and others in the past, centres in South Wales, Teesside and Scotland. I remember Corby in the 1970s, and visiting it 20 years later saw a community utterly broken by steel closure. Our thoughts at the moment are very much with the workers and people and community of Scunthorpe. The Scunthorpe Works employs 2,700 staff, as well as others in the local, national and international supply chain. The possible closure of the works would be severe for them and for the entire community. This bill talks about compensation for a steel undertaking, but is totally silent on the support for workers and the community needed in the event. Support for workers and the community in the event for disruption or worse, closure. So can I ask the Minister, are there any plans about support for the community during this period of uncertainty and what happens if negotiations don't work? We've seen from the Port Talbot experience only last autumn the effect on the community of closing down one furnace before its successor, much greener of course, is even fully planned, let alone being built. So can the Minister also say why last autumn they didn't do what they're doing today after the previous government failed to support and save Port Talbot? And what help is it providing for the Port Talbot community with new skills and enterprises? In sections 3 and 4 of the bill, turning now to the bill, in sections 3 and 4 of the bill, the Secretary of State is taking extraordinary powers to himself, and given the urgency, that is understandable. However, from these benches, we need to say to the government that you need to understand, or it needs to understand, that it has to communicate with Parliament through statements and debates on the use of these extraordinary Henry VIII powers as happens. So will the government undertake to do this? And as and when the Conservative government took these powers to itself in 2020 at the start of the COVID pandemic, it should remember that openness post-event is vital. Otherwise, the trust put in its hands by all parts of Parliament will be lost. Section 3.2 on breach of directions, power to take control of assets says, the Secretary of State may do anything for the purpose. Anything, my lords? That is certainly sweeping, and I do hope that the government will keep Parliament abreast of any such powers taken. And Section 4 offences creates very serious crimes either for the steel undertaking or for individuals associated with it, including such terms as connivance, which I'm not sure I've seen defined in criminal law before. So can I ask the Minister if the Secretary of State for the Justice Department, the Attorney General, has been consulted on the creation of these new crimes? Finally, my lords, I turn to clause 7, the compensation scheme. Whilst accepting that there needs to be such a scheme, as and when that happens, please will the government undertake to publish the full details? The behaviour of Jung Yi, outlined by the Minister, means the public needs to know the cost of compensation. From these benches, we are also concerned about the lack of a sunset clause, and we do hope that there is still time for the government to consider adding one during committee stage. My lords, we support the bill as it appears. Given the concerns we've got, the crisis must override that, and we will support the government in its deliverance.
My lords, 5 simple points. First of all, the government is absolutely correct to intervene. Like Baroness Brinton, I have had personal experience of the devastation that is wrought in communities by the closure of steel industries. Some noble lords may remember that we once had a steel industry in Scotland. 7,000 jobs in Ravenscraig itself, over 20,000 jobs in the ancillary plants, and I can testify to the absolute devastation of communities, individuals, workers, families, from the 1980s onwards. So I think the government is undoubtedly correct to intervene on social grounds alone. Second point, whatever the government does, there will be no free pass for the workforce. Let no one think this is an easy way out, because again, from my experience, I have seen the steel workers meet the challenges that these circumstances pose by getting rid of restrictive practices, increasing productivity, increasing efficiency and so on. In the case of Ravenscraig, it probably extended the life of the steelworks by 10 years or more. So I hope that the workforce in Scunthorpe respond positively and constructively to the efforts of the government intervening. Thirdly, the government are absolutely right to emphasise the crucial role of blast furnaces. This is not a mere technicality. These blast furnaces are designed to operate continuously to maintain the high temperatures and reactions that are necessary in quality steel. Turned off prematurely, they will effectively lower production, decrease quality, increase slag, and possibly render the whole edifice unworkable. A shutdown would force the entire steelworks, which relies on the furnace's molten iron, to cease operations altogether. So it is absolutely crucial, though it seems a technical point, that the government is projecting and focusing on the question of the blast furnaces. Fourthly, there is of course also a matter of wider national strategic importance. I must say I was surprised by the spokesman from the opposition benches, who seems to have forgotten that it was the previous government who sold this industry to the Chinese. We are constantly told, not least by the party opposite, that there is no firewall between the Chinese government and Chinese industry. Did it never occur to anyone in the last government that it may be, in a competitive world, in the interests of the Chinese government to purchase and then close down the British steel industry? And if that wasn't considered, then there was a gross omission of responsibility, I'm afraid, by the previous government. Finally, the potential loss of virgin steel making, which hasn't been mentioned, capacity in the UK would be very serious indeed. With the closure of the blast furnaces at Port Talbot, the only virgin or primary steel making is in Scunthorpe. Should they close that, the UK would be the only G20 country that doesn't produce its own virgin steel. For the uninitiated, virgin steel, also known as basic oxygen steel making, is primarily used in industries that require high-quality steel for various applications, including construction, manufacturing, defence and transportation. It is produced from iron ore and coke using a blast furnace process, which takes us back again to the importance of that. My lords, being the only G20 country that does not produce its own virgin steel raises immense questions around national security and whether virgin steel production should be retained as a sovereign capability. In my opinion, it should be. In conclusion, it is therefore right that the government explores every avenue to ensure that the social, economic, employment and national security implications of the present situation are addressed, and not to do so would be a dereliction of duty to the country as a whole. And therefore the government deserves our support in what is a necessary national endeavour.
My Lords, it's fair to say that the steel industry has been in special measures for some time. The Noble Lord has just referred to the acquisition that was made in 2020. Indeed, it was the last government who made sure that Scunthorpe did not close previously, and there was only one private investor prepared to take on the opportunity to invest in British steel. I'm also conscious the last government also nationalised another steel producer, Sheffield Forgemasters, again recognising how important that was to actually the needs for national security. Now, my Lords, the strategy that was put out for consultation less than 2 months ago recognises that primary steel is still important. However, the end is nigh for this blast furnace way of doing it. Now, I am concerned that, at one hand, we now seem to be in a temporary situation. Let's recognise that the technology is not around the corner. It's going to be here for a long time in order to be able to produce primary steel in a much more environmentally friendly way. But at the same time, it is concerning that Scunthorpe is actually very close to its life end, and I wanted to understand from the Minister whether the Noble Minister, whether she had asked HSE for its view on the lifetime of these assets and indeed what the cost would be of repairing it. I'm not suggesting the government should shy away from seeking to extend its life, but I think that the amount of money being invested is really important to understand that. In terms of the other issue, of course, is the supply of coke, and it's just been explained. That is the only way through a blast furnace that this can be produced today. But yet the government, within a week of taking office, decided to pull out of the legal case concerning the coke mine in Cumbria. So I would like to understand from the government whether or not they will revisit this, recognising at the moment they're now trying to source coke coal from around the world. In terms of thinking further of aspects of what the issues are in regard to this bill. It's already been mentioned about the sunset clause, but to candid to the House, I can see these powers being used for probably at least 10 years. In terms of taking charge, though, of effectively nationalising British Steel, they have made a commercial decision, so I just wanted to clarify on Clause 7, while the regulations won't be available and will be done by negative resolution, is it the Minister's expectation that there will be 100% reimbursement to the owners of British Steel? In terms of thinking, though, ahead, very clearly in the strategy, the steel strategy, it talks about the electric arc furnace. And I'm conscious that the government did have the deal in Port Talbot to make that transition. And indeed, I expect that they will want to make that transition in Scunthorpe in due course. However, there seems to be one part of the country where there is a site ready, planning permission already granted, connections already sorted with the national grid, where there is already the political will locally, but it seems very clearly not the political will nationally. And I'm sorry, my lords, it does feel that just because the voters of Teesside decided to vote for my noble friend Lord Houchin of High Leven, that where there is an open deal to be done, and it's my understanding from speaking to Lord Houchin that the owners of British Steel are keen to invest in Teesside, that actually the government has indicated that there is no way that they will help British Steel to do that. Now, my lords, this is not, dare I say, a grown-up way to think just about political back and forth, that we should not be looking to the future to have a comprehensive steel strategy and to make sure that it doesn't matter the colour of who represents people locally determines whether or not there will be good green electric arc furnaces producing steel in the future, necessary for the expansion of many industries. And I'm conscious, living in Suffolk, not far away from the nuclear power station, but also very close to where a significant number of wind farms are being constructed or will be constructed, that we do need to try and increase the amount of production of those turbines onshore with green energy. So, my lords, I'm conscious that this bill will sail through today. I'm conscious that this bill will be in place for a long time, or the Act will be in place for a long time. But we need to make sure that while steel is produced domestically, we need to make sure it covers all the sectors heading forward, as well as the ones that we are trying to rescue today.
Yeah. Difficult, in fact almost impossible, to appear more gracious than the Lord Hunter will. But for once I think I can. I thought it was extremely good of the Minister to get us a letter this morning explaining what we're up to here and the draft of the bill, and I'm grateful for that. And that's the only bit of my speech that she's going to like. I'd like to ask her 4 questions. First, what is so special about steel? Why does she say in her letter that UK-made steel is critical to the country for jobs, for economic growth and for national security? Why does she say domestic steel production is a crucial national capability? Why? Take aluminium. Aluminium is more strategic, in a sense now, given its conductivity, its use in computers, as well as for aeroplanes and vehicles. We used to have an aluminium industry in this country. We now have one tiny smelter left in Scotland. We had the largest user of electricity in Britain was the big smelter in Wales. We had a smelter in Northumberland, close to the coal industry up there. We've closed them all. We have one tiny little one left. We are happy to live off imported aluminium, coming from countries where they have bauxite, coming from countries where they have cheap electricity, like Canada. We don't feel we need, for strategic reasons, to have an aluminium industry. Why steel? Second, how are we going to ensure that this bill, which must pass, I accept, that this bill does not deter other potential inward investors? These powers are, as Baroness Brinton has said, extremely draconian powers. I was a director of a company developing an LNG plant in Russia. The techniques the Russians used to take control were much, much more subtle than this bill, this sledgehammer of a bill. How are we going to ensure that there isn't a deterrent effect from these draconian powers we're giving the Secretary of State? Third, where is the wider public interest in all this? The Minister says in her letter that the bill is a proportionate and necessary intervention in the wider public interest. I understand the community interest in Scunthorpe. I understand these arguments, but the wider public interest, compare the water industry. I understand the wider public interest in trying to stop the pollution of our rivers and beaches and trying to stop the diversion of resources into dividends for Australians. But I don't understand the wider public interest in distinguishing steel from, say, aluminium and maintaining a perpetual subsidy, because that's what I think we'll get. Perpetual subsidy for as long as we insist on having a domestic primary steel industry. What is the end game? That's my last question to the Minister. How does she see it coming to an end? In 1982, as the Noble Lord Hunt recalled, the Commons met over the Falklands. I had to go and see the Prime Minister that morning to get her to agree on the seizure of the Argentine gold held in the Bank of England. I thought it was my duty to inform her that there was much more British capital investment in Argentina than here, and we would undoubtedly see it seized in retaliation. The ratio was about 5 to 1. She dismissed the point with contumely. She said, now is hardly the time to be thinking about details like that, is it? But I feel that we need to think about the end game. In her case, the end game was obvious. She was going to take back the Falklands, and she did. How are we going to handle it down the line? British companies have failed to make a go at commercial primary steel production in Britain. Dutch companies failed to make a go. 2 successive Indian companies are failing to make a go. Here we have a Chinese company failing to make a go for it. Will the Secretary of State, using his powers of when he will nationalise it, this clearly ends in nationalisation, not today, I agree, will he do any better? Why should we expect him to do better? It seems to me that we end up, so long as we go on believing in that we have an absolute requirement to maintain a primary steel industry, we are condemned to perpetually supporting it financially. So my last question to the Minister is, what is the end game?
My Lords, I rise to totally support the government and congratulate the government for its draft bill. I think the actions of the government has changed the tone of the debate. The role of government is being redefined. There's an acceptance that government is in the business of involvement in industry where it is necessary. And I suspect in coming to the conclusions, there have been some sacred cows, if not slaughtered within the government, certainly put under some new pressures. There's much debate about jobs. If the initiative that's being taken was about jobs and jobs alone, I'm afraid I would be less sure. I suspect, as a jobs exercise, we would discover the cost per job saved to be rather high, and that rather high price would be a bad precedent. But the case that I support is the strategic case. It is impossible to imagine a period in our history since the Second World War where the world has been more unstable. I remember the Cuban crisis. I was a student at the time. It was dodgy, but it was clear in a sense that men of, and it was in those days men of serious conscience at the end of the day would find a solution, and they did. That's not at all clear now. We have all sorts of unstable characters in the mix. We could be a victim of that instability. When peace breaks out, demand for steel will escalate. The world is in a destructed state. In war zone after war zone, there will be a requirement for reconstruction, there will be a requirement for infrastructure, and there will be a requirement for growth and repair. The demand for steel will escalate in these circumstances. Defence spending will require much more specialist steels. Supply is uncertain, both in areas of specialism and overall. It is wholly credible that the world could run out of steel. And if steel fails, the results for this country would be catastrophic. I believe the government should press on with this legislation, and I accept the point that Lord Reid has made, that in the longer term it almost certainly will lead to nationalisation. It's a long time since I advocated nationalisation. Certainly, I would encourage government to beware the concept of partnership. Partnership is an unusual phenomenon at the level of the steelworks. Both parties need the same objective. A private sector partner who has the size and capability to be a useful partner has got there by good old-fashioned market objectives of maximising shareholder value. And rather sadly, in this day and age, that's short-term shareholder value. The state is entering a difficult process of maximising the public good. That's what it's there for, and I strongly recommend that it does not try to do it in a confusing partnership situation.
My Lords, it only takes a few minutes to see why British steel is dreadful trouble and chaos, where we are today. First of all, of course, its costs are very uncompetitive indeed. As my noble friend Lord Mount pointed out in his excellent opening speech, especially the costs of electric power, which has got, again, as my noble friend pointed out, some of the highest costs for industry in the entire world. So we're told. Second, there is this premature and badly planned rush to go green in all industries, not just steel, obviously, with various levies and additional costs at every point, cutting out gas and coke, as we've heard, and all other cheaper alternatives. So we just have to ask, why are electricity costs so crushingly high that they're having this effect on our economy and on the whole of our steel industry and on the Sculthorpe giant plant? It is a big plant by our standards. We're fed stuff about it being linked to the world gas price, and we're big importers of gas nowadays, of course. But this is a sort of marginal cost economic argument, which frankly could be swiftly corrected. And if we're talking about blame, it applies obviously to the previous government, just as to this government. But again, in fact, world gas prices are actually falling right now quite fast. And there is plenty of gas available right throughout the world, both through pipelines from Norway and elsewhere, and from LNG galore, although Mr. Trump may put a stop to that because most of it is coming from the shale gas and in the United States.
So no, the exceptionally high price doesn't come from that really. It comes from the fact that we have drifted as a nation into the most extravagant and costly patterns of electricity generation there could possibly be, with a massive planned increased reliance on renewables and therefore massive reliance when the wind around the UK does not blow, which is at about 3,000 hours a year, slightly under a third, to be filled mainly by new gas-fired plants, which we're sensibly looking at now, and by new nuclear, preferably small, attractive to the private sector and built on time, to ensure that we continue to get first world, reliable, affordable power supply at a vastly higher level than hitherto, which we need in a modern industrial state. My Lords, maybe in a few years, cheaper hydrogen will help on this front. But for the moment, there is actually no possible alternative to new gas-fired stations, which will have to be combined with carbon capture and storage facilities, which are only just being built. One's being built, many more needed, and of course new nuclear, which I hope will be small and attractive to private investors in line with new technology and not in the white elephant class, and a brand new transmission grid as well, estimated at a cost of £600 billion. So no wonder our small steel-making sector, which, my Lords, remember is 0.3% of the world production, as against China's 54%, we're going to be in severe trouble, and that, as Lord Kerr has just reminded us, will continue. Why? Because whether Scunthorpe is saved or not, we will continue to import Chinese steel. Most products and services in the world have a Chinese component because most of the world is computerized, and most computers have Chinese components of some kind, whether through services or actual production. I hope, my Lords, that the President of the United States understands this, but frankly, I don't think he does. Instead, I fear that he will lead us to not MAGA, not Make America Great Again, but Make America Small Again. And that would be a tragedy, and it is a tragedy which we must seek ourselves to help America recover from.
Yeah. My Lords, I welcome the attention that the Government is paying to this matter and in recognising the gravity of the situation we face. At a time of tariffs, threats to jobs and wider economic uncertainty, it is vital to safeguard the steel industry while transitioning towards a greener future. Steel, as a production of steel as an industry, is vitally important to the well-being and identity of Scunthorpe, a place I am proud to serve as Bishop. And that is before we consider its importance to our national infrastructure, so recognise the need for connectivity through our railways in order to see one another, stimulate our economy and reduce regional disparities. Protecting these jobs and the vital work done through them required action that has not appeared to be forthcoming from private investment, and I wish the Government well in its endeavours, which are not without cost. We are learning something about the state of our economy a quarter of the way through this century. When we have some distance from the immediate challenge we face today, I urge this House to engage in a broader conversation about economic trends and our role in shaping them, as well as responding to them. We've heard from the Minister, the Noble Lady of the Minister, that a former brickworks will become a theme park which could create 28,000 jobs and attract 8.5 million visitors per year. I raise this not to pass judgment on that particular investment. Indeed, who among us would be upset by the prospect of a theme park featuring both James Bond and Paddington Bear on one site? But I note that what it says about our economy, which year by year seems driven more and more by the delivery of goods and services, especially through entertainment. While our economy is changing before our eyes, the need for a secure manufacturing base is essential, all the more so given global pressures and the attendant disruption to our economic and political norms. But let me conclude by turning away from global headwinds and back towards the communities I live among in Lincolnshire. Naturally, my prayers are with the many people who will feel uncertainty and anxiety about the present and the future, who will require a response that is pastoral as well as practical. In our churches, we will seek to respond in love and to share the hope we hold on to, doing so now as we approach the disconsolation of Good Friday and the joy of resurrection on Easter Day. In response to this issue, I encourage the Government to remember the pastoral issues alongside the practical measures it is outlining today. The two are linked, and getting this right will require the Government to engage with local partners on the ground, including the combined authority and the voluntary and community sector, to ensure that we are able to respond together to the impact of what is happening to a resilient but fragile community.
My Lords, the Prime Minister is absolutely right to move quickly and ask Parliament to approve powers to protect and secure the UK steel industry. Urgent action today, which is what is before us, is absolutely in the interest of the nation and those communities where steel is such an important part of their local economies, who are feeling deep anxiety for their futures. We know that, we can feel that. Retaining our steel industry is integral to the UK's economic growth. I don't have the hesitations on that point. And to our resilience as a nation at a time of growing geopolitical turbulence. The Government's economic growth aspirations for our country mean we need more steel, not less. We need a secure supply of steel for decades to come, infrastructure, homes, energy, transport, and so many more reasons, particularly our country's defence, when we know we need to build greater national defence capability as we adapt to our changing defence alliances and emerging threats. Without that supply, we undermine our long-term economic security and lose our national resilience. As my noble friend Lord Reid spelled out, if Scunthorpe ceases production, we will be the only member of the G7 without an ability to produce virgin steel, an unthinkable proposition. Lack or loss of capacity to produce our own supply of steel also poses a wider national security interest issue for our country. If we depend increasingly on China, India or other countries for our supply, we are vulnerable to the action of others who would seek to leverage and exploit that dependency. And be in no doubt, recent world events have exposed such vulnerabilities all too clearly. We need to expand and we need to modernise our steel industry. Maintaining production in Scunthorpe through government intervention would save some 2,700 jobs at loss. It would also at risk. It would also prevent loss of many other jobs in the wider economy and supply chain. The failure to defend our steel industry would mean loss of high-value engineering, delivering bespoke and customised products, loss of high-value jobs, knowledgeable, experienced and skilled employees, very assets and people value for sustainable growth. We need more steel, not less steel, in our net zero future, something the Prime Minister recognises. Steel can contribute to our decarbonisation, not only from reducing the emissions from its production, but from the use of steel in energy infrastructure and technologies which enable that transition to a net zero economy. Demand for steel produced using less carbon-intensive processes is increasing as growing number of companies focus on reducing emissions in their supply chains, and they are very focused on it. The UK could potentially be well placed to lead on green steelmaking, given we have one of the largest scrap resources, our progress on renewable energy, the Government's intention to introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism in 2027, and its now focus on an integrated power strategy for the nation as a whole and all the economic elements of that nation. A principal cause of high electricity prices for the steel industry were high gas prices rather than the net zero cost of policies. But nonetheless, the steel industry needs an affordable, sustainable and resilient energy supply to support productive investment. Can I ask the Minister if the Government's steel strategy roadmap for the industry will specifically address those energy supply needs? And can I also ask the Minister if that steel strategy roadmap will strengthen the policy framework and strategy the building and net zero steel sector?
My Lords, during the speech of my noble friend Lord Hunt of Wirral, I carefully watched the Labour benches, and when he made some criticisms of the government, moderate criticisms of the government, he faced what I think might be described as a certain degree of genteel barracking. What I didn't see on the faces of those on the Labour benches opposite was any suggestion or hint of apology. An apology, first of all, for rushing this legislation through Parliament with practically no scrutiny when it or something like it must have been foreseeable in recent weeks. No apology at all for the policies chosen to implement net zero that have included ramping up the price of electricity to an unprecedented level and one that has no comparison in similar economies, as explained with such patience by my noble friend Lord Howell of Guildford. No apology for the incompetence of their negotiations. An insight into their negotiating ability has already been given to us in relation to the Chagos Islands, and now we see something similar happening again in relation to the steel industry. And no apology for their exultant decision recently to block the domestic mining of coal fit for coking. This is no way, my Lords, to treat Parliament, no way to treat our industrial sector, and no way to treat the workers and their families who are involved. Now, I accept that there may be a case for extraordinary measures in the case of steel production for the reasons set out, I thought, quite well by the noble Lord Tunnicliffe in relation to defence and the needs of our industry more broadly. What I'm not persuaded of is the assertion that steel is somehow exceptional. There may be a case for that, but as the noble Lord Carr of Kinlochard has pointed out, the case needs to be made, and so far the government has done nothing but assert it, and even the speech just now of the noble Baroness Lady Drake did nothing but assert what is so special about steel. What about other industries that are under threat from high electricity prices? What about glass? What about chemicals? What about cars? What about concrete? Does the government have a plan? Are these extraordinary measures that we're taking today part of a strategy, or are they simply the result of panic? Turning to the bill itself, it is remarkable. It is not, in fact, nationalisation, as the noble lady, the Minister, was keen to point out. It is, in some ways, almost worse. It is the confiscation and control of a private company, for whatever reasons, with no safeguards and no sunset clause, as things currently appear, though who knows, one may be inserted in the bill before it completes its passage. I conclude with a question, which I think illustrates the sort of the rush with which the bill has been prepared. In Clause 3, subsection 4a, the bill allows the Secretary of State to enter the premises using force if necessary. I'm just curious to know whose force he is going to use. He does not have a force at his own disposal. The bill does not give him powers to direct police forces to enter the premises. The bill creates no provision that I can see whereby he can apply to the court for something that would allow bailiffs to operate. But I'd simply like to know, as a practical matter, how is the Secretary of State going to exercise this power to use force if necessary, should the owners of the factory choose to close the doors in his face?
My Lords, I have here a long list of the numerous occasions on which in the last 10 years, I raised my concern over the emasculation of our steel industry and the fact that if we didn't do something very urgently, that actually we might well lose the ability to actually produce with a sovereign capability virgin steel. Why is that important? I think it's very important because it's important for our national security broadly and particularly military power. I can think of a number of specialist steels that are required, for example, in our deterrent submarines, in our attack submarines and elsewhere, that we used to be the world expert at producing, and now we have to go elsewhere to look for them in a world that is changing and becoming very, very dangerous. We can't rely on getting these things. Before the Second World War, we put an order in for 40,000 tons of steel with Czechoslovakia to be delivered here to help build ships. And of course, along came Hitler and he stopped all that happening, and it put us in a very difficult position. And we're in a world now where we don't know what is going to happen. Interestingly, Bismarck always referred to blood and iron, and I think that changed to blood and steel as being the most important thing for military power within your nation. And therefore it really concerned me. And at the end of this long list of times I came in, I did actually ask the last government whether they felt there was a strategic need to maintain a steel industry. And if not, how could we ensure our military and industrial resilience? And the answer I got really actually made me feel that they didn't think there was, and we wouldn't be able to do that. And I have to say I was slightly worried about all of that. So I congratulate the government, I have to say, on taking this issue seriously and taking action quickly. In the Cold War, when we used to work on how we were going to kill Soviet submarines, and we would have been jolly good at it, I hasten to add. I'm glad we didn't have a war, but we would have been good at it. The slang word for it was fastest with the mostest. In other words, you got a sniff of a submarine, you moved really quickly, and I think the government here have moved really quickly when they've seen something needed to be done, and then you put every effort, everything you had into that because you needed to kill it. And on that issue, I would say there are things that need to be done, and I'm not sure that all of them are being done, and I do have a concern about the cost of energy, I have to say. But all of those things need to be looked at. In terms of, and you'd be very sad if I didn't mention ships. Ships, of course, are made of steel, and we have too few of them. There are plans which would involve about 90,000 tonnes of steel. It's not very much, really, compared with some areas, but a lot of it's specialist steel to be used. But those plans haven't been turned into orders, and we need to order them, and we need to realise how important steel is in terms of our maritime capability, and we need to make sure orders go in to actually achieve that. And so, finally, what I would say to the government is bravo Zulu, flag hoist bravo Zulu, which is well done, because I think this is a good thing to do. I'm glad we've come in today to do this. I think it makes the nation realise it's important. I think the steel industry will realise it's important, and the steel industry is important. And as my noble friend Lord Tunnicliffe said, there is going to be a really huge demand for steel more broadly. Thank you.
My Lords, the question posed by the noble Lord Kerr of Kinlochard and then repeated by my noble friend Lord Moylan hangs in the air of your Lordship's chamber, brooding and unanswered. What is the justification for having a permanent open-ended commitment to subsidise domestic production? We've heard a perfectly reasonable case that we need lots of steel and we need security of supply, and I agree with that. But the way to have security of supply, whether of steel or of anything else, is to source it from the widest possible variety of sources so that you are not subject to a localised shock or disruption which might as easily happen on your own territory as anywhere else. And that's exactly where we are with steel. There is no foreign country that accounts for more than 15% of our total imports. Not our total use, our total imports. It's an extremely comfortable position. There is a very widespread view, I think, outside this chamber that we're somehow dependent on China or on other unfriendly autocracies. We heard it from Baroness Drake a moment ago. But actually, who are the countries that are our chief suppliers? The first is Germany, the second is Spain, the third is the Netherlands, the fourth is Belgium. Before you get to China, you still have to get through, if in some bizarre world we were blockaded by the EU, we would still be able to import from Algeria, from Turkey, from Vietnam, from South Korea, before we get to China, which accounts for only 7% of our imports. I think we need to be realistic about the numbers. And if, for whatever reason, we decide that despite that we must have, at whatever cost, some kind of domestic production capacity, then the easiest way of ensuring that is to make our industries competitive by no longer imposing on them the most expensive energy costs in the developed world. We seem to have forgotten that actions have consequences. We pass resolutions and laws, we make decisions that make us feel warm and comfortable about net zero or about closing down the coking coal mine in Cumbria or not allowing it to be opened, and then we wonder at the consequences. But if we do want to have a domestic steel capacity, the way of doing it is not to burden the producers and indeed our taxpayers with the costs of this policy, and to be honest about the realism of deferring it. Let me close by saying that we are again about to take a decision that will have consequences. And the consequence here is going to be a repeat of a policy that has never ever worked, which is nationalisation of steel, which fails every time. It's like that scene of Homer Simpson constantly trying to grab his beer can from some electric wires and electrocuting himself each time and going back to it. In 1949, in 1967, it led to disinvestment, to maladministration. It led to political rather than economic decisions. It led, in the end, not only to the failure of the industry, but left taxpayers on the hook, as it will this time, to the tune of £700,000 a day in this case. The dog returns to his vomit, and the sow returns to her mire, and the burnt fool's bandaged finger goes wobbling back to the fire.
My lords, like many of your lordship's house, I think I've lived through the history of the steel industry. In the 70s and the 80s, we had the debate over nationalisation, privatisation, nationalisation, privatisation, and in the last 10 years, we've had a series of crises, I suppose culminating until now with Port Talbot, where the last blast furnace was closed in 2024, leaving Scunthorpe as the UK's only remaining primary steelmaking facility. Of course, Port Talbot now has planning permission given for the construction of electric arc furnaces, but they won't come on stream until 2028. I think it is accepted, with the possible exception of Lord Kerr, and maybe noble Lord Hannan, on all sides, that steel is a nationally strategic sector, which supports thousands of skilled jobs. And as many noble lords have said, that if Scunthorpe is allowed to close, we will be the only G7 country without primary steel capacity. So where does it all go wrong? Lord Moylan was calling for the government to apologise. Is he going to apologise for the last government's behaviour with the steel industry, allowing it to lurch from near collapse to last-minute rescue? Is Lord Moylan going to apologise for his government scrapping the industrial strategy? And is he going to apologise for approving the sale of Scunthorpe to what is probably a front for the Chinese government? My lords, of course, you would expect me to say this. Brexit didn't help. Reducing our capability of selling into Europe, which we had done with some success before Brexit. And of course, Trump hasn't helped with his 25% steel tariffs. And I would say to Lord Hannan, I think the risk of China only selling 7% to us is not now that, it's that China will now use the opportunity given by Trump to dump steel into the UK market. So what do we need? We need a real industrial strategy, giving manufacturers certainty, with clear plans for the steel industry. We probably need a complete overhaul of business rates, giving steel mills breathing room. And of course, we need a new UK-EU customs union reopening up export markets for us with the EU and rebuilding our previously existing trade links. In the meantime, any steps the government can take to keep Scunthorpe operational are obviously welcome, apart from one or two, to your lordships, apart from one or two speakers, giving the government time to implement the essential measures I outlined above. And so from these benches, we support this. But the big question, as one or two noble lords have said, does remain. The government has earmarked £500 million, I think, to purchase new materials, and this was turned down by the Chinese owners. But if the government has to nationalise the plant because no private sector interest has come forward, the funding costs will be huge. A new electric arc furnace costs £3 billion, and Scunthorpe may need two. Now, £6 billion will test the limit of the Chancellor's fiscal rules.
My Lords, the Round Oak Steelworks was a steel production plant in Brierley Hill, West Midlands, very close to where I grew up. Many of my classmates' fathers worked there, meaning I was often asked as a child, "Can we come round yours to play? My dad's on nights," as my dad didn't work nights. During the Industrial Revolution, the majority of iron making in the world was carried out within 20 miles of Round Oak. At its peak, like in Scunthorpe now, thousands of people were employed at the works. The steelworks was the first in the United Kingdom to be converted to natural gas, which was supplied from the North Sea. The works were nationalised in 1951, privatised in 1953, and nationalised again in 1967, although the private firm Tube Investments continued to manage part of the operations at the site. They went through other ownership in later years. The steelworks finally closed in December 1982, making the remaining 1,300 workers redundant. Gone were not only those jobs making steel, but all the ancillary work that went with it, supplying goods and services to Round Oak, which provided work to thousands more local people. With it went the social network and community fabric of the sort the noble Lady Baroness Brinton referred to in Corby, and my noble friend Lord Reid so eloquently spoke about in Glasgow. After the closure at Round Oak, unemployment rates locally reached 25%, which was shockingly bad even for the early 1980s. I am therefore very pleased to support our government's efforts in this bill to preserve steel production in Scunthorpe and the once proud industry in our country and jobs, and to try to avoid the devastating and long-lasting effects of mass local job losses, and with it the sense of community and support that existed where I grew up, and no doubt does in Scunthorpe, which has a similarly long history of steelmaking.
My Lords, I refer to my register of interests. Scunthorpe, as we've heard from many speakers today, is a proud steel town, and I have known for many years, and its people are fighting with every strength and resilience they have to keep those coke ovens burning, with 2,700 jobs hanging in the balance, and with every family in the area, there are some connection or know someone working there, plus the hundreds of people employed in the supply chain, which will be thrown into chaos if Scunthorpe loses its steel capacity. As the big British Steel sign shows, and it says, Scunthorpe, building stronger futures. But there'll be no future if the coking coal does not arrive in time to keep Anne and Victoria, the blast furnaces, going hot. If the blast furnaces are closed in an unplanned way, they can never be reopened. The decision today, this important decision today, feels like everything is going down to the wire. Scunthorpe is proud, and rightly so, that it makes the highest grade virgin steel available. And let us not forget, we will be the only country in the G20, which we've heard from many speakers today, which doesn't produce primary steel, against a proud 160-year industrial legacy if we let the blast furnaces go cold. All this against the backdrop for demand for steel is likely to go up and not down. This threatens our resilience and national security as steel becomes the subject of tariffs and trade conflicts. And as we know, there is already a proposal on the table for a 25% tariff on steel export to the US, which we have to be very mindful of. The UK has much scrap steel, but it is the import we need of large quantities of iron pellets and coking coal, though we do have the Cumbria mine, which has been mentioned before, ready to develop, which could supply coking coal in the interim. Transition will take a period of time, so it's vital we keep the blast furnaces burning in Scunthorpe whilst working towards a gradual transition to low-carbon arc furnaces. Regrettably, the ongoing issue is for the workforce who are working with high electric prices, and the industry has called for a cap on energy prices for heavy industry in order to match. We are twice as much charged for than Germany and France for their industrial electricity prices, which does not allow us to compete on a level playing field. This is unfair competition and has to be addressed. And finally, my lords, the government must do the right thing during the period of transition, and that is to bring the Scunthorpe site back into public ownership while protecting workers during this time with a clear plan for the workforce. How can the UK not produce its own steel, high quality steel? My lords, it must and it should.
Yeah.
My lord, it's an honour to follow the speech of the Baroness Redfern, which showed real understanding of what the position is. My lords, the facts are clear. Without intervention, Xinjiang will not commit to buy raw materials immediately. Those raw materials are required immediately to prevent the blast furnaces cooling down. If they cool down, permanent damage is done to the blast furnaces and they cannot be repaired. If the blast furnaces cool down, then the plant is lost, and the consequence of that is that the United Kingdom ceases to have the ability to produce primary steel. That means steel that is not made with scrap metal, but is the highest quality steel. The government is absolutely right to intervene. The government is absolutely right to try to solve this problem by negotiations. They have failed, not because of their efforts, and they now intervene to save the steel plant at Scunthorpe, and they are right to do so. It is churlish of those opposite to say that they've left it too late. They've done all they can, now they move to save. Whilst there are difficult questions about how you ensure steel production, there should be no real question that we should try to ensure that there is a domestic steel production in this country. I disagree with the Noble Lord, Lord Kerr, the Noble Lord, Lord Moylan, and the Noble Lord, Lord Hannan, that we should not have a domestic steel industry. I disagree as well with Kemi Badenoch, the Business Secretary in February 2023, who said that perhaps we shouldn't have a domestic steel industry. That may explain why those opposite found it so difficult during the past few days to decide whether or not they supported this bill or not. And I'm still at a loss to discover whether they support it or not. Steel is essential for the modern economy. It has no viable substitutes that can match its unique properties of strength, durability and versatility, and it is critical as an important element of almost all infrastructure and construction, and an essential part of a broad range of manufacturing supply chains. As well as making the UK a clean energy superpower, steel is a fundamental component in activities such as the construction of wind turbines, manufacturing the next generation of electric or autonomous vehicles, or building the infrastructure needed to sustain our digital economy, particularly in advanced manufacturing, clean energy industries and defence. For example, it is estimated that offshore wind alone will require 25 million tonnes of steel. That represents a potential 21 billion market for UK steel. The government is also committed to delivering 1.5 million homes over this Parliament. This too will accelerate the use of industrial construction and offer new demand for steel, providing opportunities to the industry. And of course, defence, as my noble friend the Lord Westerspit referred to. The Ministry of Defence is currently undertaking an independent strategic defence review alongside the development of a defence industrial strategy. This will inform our understanding of future steel demand, which is bound to increase as defence expenditure increases. The noble Lord, Lord Moylan, said it was only assertion. The noble Lord Hannan, said we should rely on the foreign production of steel, which we should import. We should not. We should have our own domestic steel industry, and it may well be that it will have to be subsidised to some extent by the state. But we should take that responsibility. Yes. And as the noble Baroness Redfern said in her very impressive speech, we should save the town of Scunthorpe and make sure that there are jobs.
My Lords, I would love to support the government wholeheartedly on this bill. From wind turbines to trains to steel will be needed for the transition to a green economy. But this bill contains huge powers for the Secretary of State and also, of course, no sunset clauses. That's always going to be a source of problems. I'm also worried that this is the same old story of taxpayer money paying for private profits and private sector failure. We've seen it with the water industry, where bill payers are taking the hit for billions of pounds in shared dividends payments, and a third of my own water bill goes on paying debt. We saw it with the steel mill of Port Talbot, which was a missed opportunity that still grieves many people in Wales. We saw it with the collapse of Carillion, the private sector company that existed on public sector contracts. It paid out higher and higher dividends for 16 years. The owners fleeced it and left the pension fund £500 million short, and of course cost the taxpayer 148 million. Instead of the government doing the obvious thing and taking over these failing companies, they should be bringing them into public ownership so that we can run them better and bring down bills. We keep throwing bill payers' money at them and expecting a different result. No government anyway should allow key infrastructure to fall into foreign private investors' hands in the first place. The minute it's not profitable, they pull out with no recourse. I have a few questions for the noble lady, the Minister. What is the government model for ownership? Because if we do put £500 million into keeping this plant going, what are we getting back? Are we getting shares in the company? Are we getting worker representatives put onto the board? Are we getting guarantees that the steel plant will be handed over to the public sector? And my second question is, the noble lady, the Minister, said in her opening remarks that all options are under review, and yet one constantly gets the feeling that for this government, for this Labour government, nationalisation is something that spooks them quite badly, and I would like to know if nationalisation is actually one of those options under review. And thirdly, what is the government's timetable for shifting the Scunthorpe blast furnaces from coal to green hydrogen? We have an increasing number of days when our wind farms and solar panels are producing more renewable energy than the national grid needs. Instead of closing things down on those days when renewables cost us nothing, why don't we use that free energy to produce hydrogen? And we must not leave the future of steel communities, steel workers, to the whims of multinational companies or bullies in the White House. These communities deserve better, and a green steel in public ownership is the way to ensure these communities not only survive, but thrive into the future.
My Lords, It's with great joy that I commend my government for redeeming its promise to Scunthorpe. It's a place I know well. I do a lot of work in Grimsby, and without this, it will be another town left to die. I am sad, but not surprised by the unrepentant Thatcherism expressed by Lord Hunt. The whole escapade of privatisation subordinated our national security and our national assets to profiteers. It has ended up under Chinese ownership or hostile power. We have to assert our absolute fundamental national interest in preserving the steel industry. I apologise to the House for not speaking more here. I think I was the only member of this House to be invited to the inauguration, so I will share one story. I was sitting in the White House and President Trump walked past with his entourage. He's entirely one-faced, by the way, he's always the same. And he was saying that his favourite word in the English language was tariff. I remember that. And that was a discussion in terms of putting industrialisation as the prime goal of US policy rather than the producers, rather than the consumers. And I was sitting with a group of his advisors and I said, what's your favourite word? And one of them said, the United States of America. And I said, that's 4 words, 1 word. And they said, oh, America. Another one said family. They asked me my favourite word and I said, nationalisation. I seek the opposite to you. I seek assurances that the steel industry will never, ever be put back into the hands of profiteers and hostile powers. I believe this is a hugely important moment for us in that we can now develop what has been squandered over the last 50 years, which is our industrial strength and our industrial power. This is absolutely vital for our defence and our defence industry. It's not just, Lord Faulkner, my noble friend, it's not just the digital economy and it's not just all of those things. We have to produce weapons now. We're engaged. This morning I received many phone calls from Ukraine saying, so it's true, you are engaged in an industrial strategy. But we are living, as the Prime Minister said, in a new era, and I urge the House to pay attention to the Prime Minister's words, an era based on national security and not merely the whims of the market. A new era based entirely the opposite to the era that you pioneered, not based on finance in the city, but based on the faraway towns and industry. I absolutely respected the noble Baroness Redfern's speech. It's going to be based on weapons production and not TV production. It's a very, very different world. And Easter is coming. It's Passover for me tonight, so I may have to leave a little early, but I certainly believe in the resurrection, and it should be in our thoughts. The resurrection of Scunthorpe. I believe it is said that the last will be first. If we can have an absolutely modern, productive steel power in Scunthorpe, it will be one of the most wonderful miracles that we could witness. I think that Port Talbot is absolutely necessary, and we have to also integrate it with titanium and with graphite. These are the modern materials of industrial top-end weapons production. Baroness Jones, I entirely agreed with you in what you just said there. But if Scunthorpe could become the European leader in steel production, then I believe that we will have a proper Labour government, a Labour government that actually puts Labour first, workers first, our national security first, our defence industry first. And I believe that today, if we could only hear that beautiful word, nationalisation, I think this will be a great day, a day to celebrate.
My Lords, can I just associate myself with a comment around how wonderful it is that the staff have been able to open up on a Saturday to facilitate this very, very important debate. Of course, the government had to act quickly. Speed is of the essence here. But if that speed is of any use, it remains to be seen, because there's many things going on now that the government will have to focus on and make very quick and decisive decisions. This bill would have been far better if there was a longer debate had, because as has been said many times in the Lordship's chamber, there is some very draconian powers about to be handed out. and how they're administered will send a message around the world about who we are as a place to do business. For me personally, I want to concentrate mainly on the effects that will happen to the community. The Noble Baroness Ramsey, Baroness Brinton and Baroness Redfern very clearly highlighted the reverberations this will have on communities in Scunthorpe where the blast furnaces are. But I, as a Londoner, we have very little relationship with steel, but we do have some. Rainham Steel is a business that's out in Essex, very close to London, that's been a viable employer for years, exactly the kind of business that pushes our economy and provides employment, and they will suffer if this situation is not resolved in the correct way. Having said that, I have 3 questions for the Minister that I'd like to have answered. Again, as a Londoner, steel is not my specialisation, but communities are. I come from a community that struggles hugely with high levels of unemployment. And the idea that you'll whip away an entire community's employment makes this a social question as much as it's a financial question, as much as it is a strategic development question for our country. So how can British Steel survive under the current burdensome regulations, unrealistic net zero targets, especially those around importing materials from abroad rather than using coke from here? Yeah. And I want to be clear about the targets, the net zero targets. I'm not saying we shouldn't have them, but are they the correct targets? Are they targets that are driving our industries into the ground, making it uncompetitive to run a business in this country, or are they targets that are cleaning our environment? We need to make sure we don't do one at the expense of the other. Has there been a financial impact assessment made on the cost regarding this bill? Because it may not be nationalisation, but the effect for the British taxpayer will be the same, a huge, huge and growing ongoing bill. And if that hasn't been made as an assessment, it really needs to be done urgently, because unfortunately that cost will reverberate with other communities in this country when we cannot afford the support that they need because we are spending it subsidising this one particular industry. And how long will this arrangement last? There is no sunset clause, but there also seems to be no idea of how long it will go on. And I refer you to my former question. If we have a growing bill and no way to end that bill, what happens? The British taxpayer is on the hook for it again and again and again. And that's something that we need to get a handle on. Now, I wish this government every success in resolving the situation speedily, but history would suggest that governments are not good at procurement. Governments are not good at running businesses efficiently. And ultimately, if this business cannot stand on its own 2 feet, what are we going to do then? It is very, very important that we keep the strategic ability to deliver our own steel. So what are the government going to do around making it work as a business? We've heard lots of talk in the chamber about the high amount of steel that will be needed into the future. Well, if that's the case, surely the business is viable today. What work will the government do to make sure those orders come in, that this business works, to protect this community and to protect our strategic goings-on around the production of warships in particular? So I ask the Minister, can she answer these questions in a direct, simple way that people from my community and also communities across the country can understand? There's an awful lot of finger-pointing in the chamber this morning, and the people of Scunthorpe, whose jobs and livelihoods and families are at risk, they don't want to see finger-pointing, they want to see a resolution.
My Lords, the Minister said that the government seeks to take control of blast furnaces at Scunthorpe without taking control of British Steel. It's really trying to avoid the words nationalisation and public ownership, but that is really where we are heading. British Steel's most recent accounts show falling turnover, increasing losses and negative net worth. It is bankrupt and the compensation should be very little, if any. Steel is essential for civil and defence industries. In a world of trade wars, we need to be self-sufficient. We need permanent public ownership of the steel industry. I do not support temporary nationalisation under which the public purse revives the industry and the government then hands it back to the private sector for more subsidies. One of the reasons for the current crisis is that privatisation of essential industries has failed. The 1988 privatisation of steel by the Conservative government was completely divorced from any industrial strategy, need for jobs and self-reliance. There are those who object to nationalisation, but at the same time they have been content for governments to hand vast subsidies to the steel industry. This free money enables companies to acquire assets and income streams which enrich their shareholders, and they always keep coming back for more and more. Steel making is in crisis because of the failure of other privatizations. Steel making relies upon extensive use of energy, but our energy costs are absolutely extortionate. For industrial electricity, British businesses pay the highest electricity price in the developed world. It is twice the EU average, 2.6 times the Korean cost, and 4 times that of the US, and even more compared to China. In the last 4 years, the UK's 20 biggest energy companies have made operating profits of £514 billion, and in doing so, they have destroyed steel and other industries. With the use of electric arc furnaces, UK steel would be even more expensive and uncompetitive. Some 34,000 gallons of water are used to produce 1 ton of steel, but water costs are extortionate too. No steel nationalisation or industrial strategy can succeed without control of the key costs. So can the Minister explain how the government will control profiteering associated with energy and water industries? Yesterday, the Prime Minister said that he will protect, I quote, he said, he will protect British jobs and British workers, and added, quote, jobs, investment, growth, our economic and national security are all on the line, unquote. Against this background, the people in Scotland and Wales really deserve a straight answer. Grangemouth, Scotland's only refinery, is set to close with the loss of thousands of jobs, but the government has not sought to bring it into public ownership. Why? The government did not prevent the closure of traditional steel making at Port Talbot in Wales. Tata could have accompanied its electric arc furnace with another plant making direct reduced iron, as suggested by trade unions. Again, the government did not support that strategy. Why not? The inevitable conclusion is that a London-based government protects jobs in England but does not really care about job losses and decline in Scotland and Wales. Can the Minister please explain why the government is willing to save Scunthorpe plant but not Grangemouth or Port Talbot?
Can I say at the outset that I agree with the premise that the UK needs a flourishing domestic virgin steel industry to enable our industrial regeneration goals to be met. But may I also be allowed to express my deep personal regret that virgin steel will no longer made in Wales. My father started his career in Cardiff Steelworks at a time when Welsh steel, particularly that from Llanwern, was known to be the best in the world. But I also echo the deep concern that has been aired throughout this House in the way this has been handled and the potential enormous cost that may fall upon the taxpayer. I hope that the government will agree to a sunset clause, at least to enable them to take stock at some point in the future. From now, my thoughts go out to the steelworkers and their families during an undoubtedly stressful and anxious period. Now may not be the time for political posturing or indeed engaging in a baseless blame game, but the facts do speak clearly for themselves. My Lords, there are a number of issues that have directly caused this precarious situation that we now face. For the last few years, it's become increasingly apparent that Chinese companies have developed an insatiable agenda to close down all its competition in the steel market. The hostile actions of the parent company, coupled with some reckless decisions undertaken by this government, has engineered this predicament. The government's failure to tackle crippling energy prices and instead decide to hike national insurance have caused further, and might I add, unnecessary pressures on our already struggling industry. My Lords, if you require any further evidence of this government's short-sightedness, you just need to remember that it was the current Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband, who decided to block the planning application from last September from West Cumbrian Mining Limited to mine the coking coal necessary to make virgin steel. Now it must be imported at greater financial and environmental cost. Bluntly, this made no sense and caused some of our plants to become even less competitive. The Labour government's poor decision-making has helped engineer the steel crisis. This, my Lords, then begs the pertinent question. The government must have seen the writing on the wall, so why did it take them so long to act? When faced with a crisis, it is imperative that we act swiftly and decisively, just as the last Conservative government did with Port Talbot Steelworks. In 2023, the government was told by Tata Steel the plant needed to undergo operational changes or face closure, meaning 10,000 jobs would be lost. The company was facing £1.5 million losses every single day, a huge financial shortfall that no company could sustain, nor indeed could any government. Importantly, it was known that the 2 blast furnaces there were nearing the end of their useful lives. The Conservative government acted quickly, leaving no stone unturned in trying to save as many jobs as possible. The agreed plan involved a £500 million government grant support package to build an electric arc furnace, plus millions more to help retrain those who would lose their jobs. An electric arc furnace, which is currently being built on the site, will make us less dependent on imports because it will recycle the UK's huge tonnage of domestic scrap steel. And of course it is my hope that one day Port Talbot will have a dedicated power supply provided by an on-site advanced modular nuclear reactor, such as those that data centres are actually helping to finance in order to secure their own energy demands. Nationalisation should be a last resort. It is always the taxpayer who will be footing the bill. I am confident that everyone in this House will agree with me when I say steel is of strategic national importance and we cannot allow the Scunthorpe plant to fail.
The government is to be congratulated for acting decisively and promptly. Like, I think, Lord Hunt of Wirral, I came here thinking that we were going to be debating the nationalisation of the steel industry. I confess I am disappointed to find out that we are not. But the bill that the government has put forward buys space and time for the government to put forward a real plan for the saving of the steel industry. I hope that the ultimate decision will be that the steel industry will be nationalised. It's a national asset, as many speakers have described today. And by national asset, I don't just mean the blast furnaces, the presses, the cranes and the buildings. It is, of course, the workforce as well, which form a national asset, and they deserve to be protected. Lords, the bill that the government has put forward is one that demonstrates the complete failure of privatisation in this industry. I hope the government will conclude that nationalisation is the answer, and I hope too that they will consider that remedy for Grangemouth, for the water industry, and of course for the energy industry, whose profiteering has done so much damage to the steel industry.
My Lords, why have we been recalled with such urgency to debate the future of British steel? The immediate answer is that the blast furnaces at Scunthorpe require to be fed with iron ore and coking coal to keep their fires alight. If the fires were to be extinguished, then the contents of the furnaces would solidify, and we should lose our capacity for creating virgin steel from basic ingredients. We should lose a facility on which we've relied for more than 300 years to sustain our industrial productivity. Our steelmaking capacity would become entirely dependent on electric arc furnaces, which would be used for reprocessing scrap metals. The Chinese owners of British Steel, who are Jinghe Corporation, have been impervious to the blandishments of the government, who have offered to pay for the ingredients that would feed the blast furnaces. From their point of view, it's simply uneconomic to produce steel in Britain. The problems of our steel industry were developing throughout the Conservatives' period in office, during which time the industry has been in foreign ownership and in financial crisis. The British Steel Corporation was privatised in 1988 by the Thatcher government. And it merged with the Dutch National Steel Company in 1999 to form the Chorus Group. This was taken over in 2007 by the Indian Tata Steel Corporation. And in 2016, Tata divested itself of its UK assets, which were acquired by Greybill Capital for the sum of £1. And it was sold to the Chinese Jingye Corporation in 2020. The writing has been on the wall long before the acquisition by Tata Steel. However, during the years of the Conservative administration, nothing was done to protect this strategic asset. The question that concerns us today is whether it is appropriate to take drastic and costly action to protect our native steel industry, and whether it is an industry that's worth saving. And I believe that the preservation of our native steel-making capacity is a national priority. Our long-term prosperity and our national security depend on our being self-reliant. And if we do not create a viable industry on the basis of the existing British Steel Corporation, then we should be hard put to re-establish a steel industry. An immediate issue is whether the two blast furnaces at Scunthorpe need to be kept alive. And the answer must be in the affirmative. They represent the only means by which we can produce high-grade steels that are required by our automotive and our aviation industries. And the preservation of the blast furnaces would be the first step in a protracted process of restructuring our steel industry, which would be beset by numerous difficulties. Blast furnaces require iron ore and coking coal that come from foreign sources, and Sweden is no longer the principal source of iron ore, which comes mainly from Russia, Brazil and Australia. And coking coal exports are dominated by Australia, the US, Canada, Russia and Mongolia, which together account for 90% of the world's exports. By the way, I must assert that Cumbrian coal, which has a high sulphur content, is inappropriate for producing coking coal. The preservation of our blast furnaces, I apologise, I lost myself. Ultimately, blast furnaces which depend on vulnerable supplies of materials and which produce large quantities of carbon dioxide must be replaced by other technologies which are yet to be fully developed. These might depend on hydrogen and on electrochemical processes, but in the meanwhile, some major reorientations will be required if we're to fully exploit the technology of electric arc furnaces. At present, Britain exports 80% of its scrap steel, making it the world's second largest exporter, and we are thereby stripping ourselves of a vital resource at a time of rising domestic demand. The scrap steel ought to be consigned to domestic arc furnaces. However, Britain has, as we've heard time and again, some of the world's costliest industrial electricity. The cost is 3 or 4 times greater than in the United States and significantly greater than in any of our European neighbours. And the costs of our electricity are due to in large measure, to the costs of our network, which is increasingly reliant on renewable sources of energy that are intermittent. Such costs will not be alleviated unless we resolve to generate a substantial proportion of our electricity from nuclear power. And the preservation of our steel industry, the preservation of our steel producing capacity will depend upon a long-term strategic plan with social direction from the government, as well as ample funds provided by the government. And this surely implies the nationalisation of the industry. And in the absence of such a strategy, we will become increasingly dependent on and subservient to other nations who will be both the owners of our industrial infrastructure and the providers of our strategic materials.
My Lords, at this point in this vital debate, almost everything that can be said has been said, so I'm certainly not going to repeat everything. I just observed that, of course, there used to be steel making in London. Not so long ago, the last historic bell-making foundry closed, and you can still see the names of steel-producing companies as you look at bridges and various other means transport production. The transition to green production is going to be vital and requires the production of coking coal. It is a savage irony that the current owners
have been reported as visiting Scunthorpe, as asking Scunthorpe workers, do they want to transfer to China to produce coal there? And I thought that was an interesting proposal, but not one that we would want to support. So what I would like to ask the government is, will they reconsider the decision not to support the Cumbrian mine, which can produce high-quality coking coal? I might have a disagreement with the previous speaker. And if that isn't going to be the source, what is going to be the source of coking coal that will be required to keep the Scunthorpe mine open during the transition period?
My Lords, I had not intended to speak in this short debate, but I feel compelled to do so as a member of the Constitution Committee because the government has not answered all of the questions which the Constitution Committee in its report on fast-track legislation, constitutional implications and safeguards had set out ought to be answered when the House is being asked to approve fast-track legislation and when the normal processes of scrutiny are being truncated. In the explanatory notes, which in these circumstances become more important than usual, there are several questions, 14 in all. It's all right, my Lords, I'm not going to do 14 questions, just 2. There are questions set out very specifically, and 2 of those questions have not been addressed, and I hope that the Minister will be able to address these specific questions when the summing up in the debate takes place. The first is, does the bill include a sunset clause? If not, why does the government judge that this inclusion is not appropriate? Well, the answer given in the explanatory notes is the bill does not include a sunset clause. Yep, that's obvious in the bill, but there's no explanation as to why there is no sunset clause. And secondly, the other question which has been omitted is, are mechanisms for effective post-legislative scrutiny and review in place? If not, why does the government judge that their inclusion is not appropriate? Again, the answer is that the government decided that such scrutiny and review were not needed, but there's no explanation as to why. It would assist the House if those questions could be answered before we are asked to make decisions.
Yeah.
My Lords, it's been an unanticipated pleasure to have a debate with you today. I think many of us following the British Steel saga expected to find ourselves at some point debating the issues in your Lordship's House. I don't think we expected to be debating them today. Now, I won't comment on how on earth this scramble happened, but I would, like the Chief Whip and others, like to thank the House authorities, Black Rod and her team, and those all across the House who made this debate possible. Thank you very much. My Lords, the noble Lord Hunt of Wirral, with his characteristic hubris, made remarkable accusations. Remarkable because the decline of the steel industry has largely been under the auspices of his party. Years of neglect and drift have happened under their watch, my Lords, and they have led to the crisis that we now see today. So I don't think the government should be taking any lessons from that party, and I don't think they will. My Lords, having got to see the bill for the first time just a few hours ago, and I thank the noble lady, the Minister, for her characteristically clear explanation and for her letter. It is, my Lords, a bill that gives the government of the day very strong powers. And it is, of course, a shame that we should be rushing it through, but from these benches we understand why the reason for haste is there. Time is now of the essence. The future of the UK's last blast furnaces at Scunthorpe Steelworks hang in the balance. Closure would bring British virgin steel production to an end, as noble lords have set out. Now, as we've heard and as we've read, Scunthorpe's Chinese owners, Jingji, I learn I should pronounce them, Jingji, have turned down offers of help, and they declare the Lincolnshire plant as unviable. My Lords, President Trump's tariffs seem to have been a final straw and exposed the remaining elements of the British steel industry to a harsh global reality. And perhaps those in the past who've spoken volubly and favourably on the merits of Trump 2 would now like to reflect on a global trading environment with higher tariffs than in living memory, and that's after the 90-day suspension. My Lords, owning and running a steel business should be a long-term enterprise. It should be measured in decades, not months. Scunthorpe's owners since 1988 include the British-Dutch Chorus Partnership, the India-Tata conglomerate, then Greyball Capital, and finally Jingji. And for the latter, Scunthorpe has been a bit-part player in a global multinational with strong Chinese government links. Jingji obviously seems happy to walk away from the government's £500 million offer to keep Scunthorpe open. But steel is not a bit-part player for our industrial economy. If Britain is to have a green and a long-term industrial strategy, if it is to have a defence industrial strategy, it needs steel. So finally, after years of successive governments producing piecemeal temporary fixes, we actually reach the crux. It is now or never, and, my Lords, nationalisation seems to be the only route to some sort of salvation. Steel has been there, of course, before, as my noble friend pointed out, but of late, nationalisation has been anathema. Perhaps we shouldn't be so squeamish, my Lords. As my noble friend pointed out, the French, Irish, Danish and Norwegian governments own our wind farms. The Dutch state runs our trains, and the Chinese government, through PetroChina, owns part of Grangemouth, UK's oldest oil refinery. So no matter what the noble lady, the Minister, had to say, this bill looks like a paving bill for nationalisation. Yeah. And given the sweeping powers within this bill, can the Minister tell your Lordship's House what additional powers it thinks it needs to grant itself the full ownership of this industry? Indeed, does it actually need any more powers than are currently within that bill? And given this is one part of the UK's remaining steel industry, how does Port Talbot fit into the picture? My Lords, Clause 7 speaks to compensation. Now, there are government-backed finance in this. Can the Minister assure us that the measures taken today will not inadvertently increase the value of this business and therefore increase the necessary compensation that may be forthcoming from this government? Yeah. And finally, can the Minister tell your Lordship's House what will happen to the other Jingji steel businesses in the United Kingdom? My Lords, we're still waiting for the government's so-called modern industrial strategy, but now, with steel in the balance and automotive on the edge, it is time for the government to get it out there and start working with industry to deliver it. And within that strategy, the future of our steel industry must have a place. We are clear that steel should be classified as a national strategic asset, backed by a comprehensive plan to ensure that more British steel is used in vital infrastructure projects, from defence to renewable energy. And I say to Lord Kerr, it's just because we abandoned aluminium, why should we abandon steel? My Lords, however, within the industrial industrial and defence strategies, the government also needs to determine what sort of steel we actually need, what sort of steel we need to produce locally in order to deliver on our key strategic and security objectives. My Lord, that requires a real analysis as to whether electric arc manufacture can actually produce the sorts of steel that we need. So can the Minister assure your Lordship's House that this analysis is a priority and will be published before any irrevocable steps are taken on the blast furnace? That begs the question, of course, on environmental impact and energy. Whatever the future looks like, it must still be executed within a long-term carbon strategy. We do not support going back on our environmental objectives. But I suggest that the route to achieving them might be a different route from the one that was envisaged a while ago. Second, my lords, it is clear that certain key industries are massively hampered by energy costs. It is a big issue. It's a big issue that this government handed to that government. The price for energy has not materially increased since the Conservative Party relinquished control of the government. That is there on their watch, not on the watch of this government, but it is now on the watch of this government to do something about it. And that is what we will be looking to happen. My lords, we also need to understand, as has been pointed out, how the UK will handle the issue of Chinese dumping of steel on our industry. With the US market gone, how will the government create a level competitive playing field? Can I ask that the Trade Remedies Authority accelerates its review of Chinese market? And so to another international issue. My lords, the government is not at this stage taking the enterprise into full public ownership. So presumably it will be transferring money from a UK taxpayer to the plant ownership. Parts of Clause 2 and 5D give the necessary powers. This is a government that seeks to uphold the international rule of law, and there are commitments on subsidies arising from the UK's continued membership of the World Trade Organization. These are primarily set out in the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. Further commitments are contained in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade Agreement on trade-related investment measures and the General Agreement on Trade and Services. These are not new commitments, as their lordships know. The UK was subject to WTO rules when it was a member state of the EU. Furthermore, the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement contains a chapter on subsidies which is aimed at ensuring subsidies do not have a detrimental effect on trade and investment between the UK and the EU. The requirements of the TCA are incorporated into the UK's Subsidy Control Act, which has been enforced since the 4th of January 2023. Now, I think it's important for the Noble Lord the Minister to set out how, under its proposed activity, it will meet these international obligations. I want the government to succeed, but it should succeed within the rule of international law. More especially, at a time when we desperately need to have a closer trading relationship with the European Union, as set out by my noble friend, we want to know how will this bill, these actions, affect our relationship via the TCA obligations that we have made. My lords, I had the pleasure of working on the Subsidy Control Bill, and it seems to be the core of this issue, yet somehow absent from any discussion of the bill. Given the complexity of the bill, I do not propose to go into details, but sections 20 and sections 19 are the key specific areas. My lords, a subsidy given during the preparation by an enterprise of restructuring plan can be legal as long as it contributes to the objective of public interest, which is why that is in the point that Noble Care made. And I think that is what it is seeking to achieve. However, further on, there's a condition that the public authority giving the subsidy needs to be satisfied that the restructuring plan is credible, is based on realistic assumptions, and is prepared with a view to ensuring the return to long-term viability of the enterprise within a reasonable time period. Do we have such a plan, my lords, and when will we get one? Perhaps the noble lord can give a brief answer to this subsidy issue and set out detail in writing as to how we will meet our legal obligations to support the Scunthorpe plant. My lords, there has been a great deal of concern expressed about the open-ended nature of this bill and the strength of the measures contained therein. We do believe that there needs to be some end product, some end point in this bill. We are happy to discuss with His Majesty's Government ways of alleviating our concerns on this. But these are genuine concerns that I think are felt right across this chamber and possibly at the other end. My Lords, I close. This is a very difficult time for the people of Scunthorpe and everybody connected with this important plant. I will close by reiterating comments we've heard right across the House, that our thoughts go with this community. Our thoughts go to the people who must be sick with worry about what is going to happen in their town. But, my Lords, we on these benches will do our utmost to support and maintain this industry so that it can move forward and they can have a future.
My Lords, can I begin by thanking all noble lords who have attended to contribute to this important debate today, and indeed repeat thanks to all the House authorities who have allowed this to happen. The fact that members of both houses have been called in for an emergency sitting reflects in part the way that this government has managed this issue. Reports released earlier this week clearly show that serious questions over the delivery of coking coal were left outstanding following talks with the CEOs of Jingjay and British Steel on Wednesday, and it was clear that they did not yield a deal. Indeed, British Steel released a statement on the 27th of March in which they said, and I quote, "The blast furnaces and steel-making operations at Scunthorpe are no longer financially sustainable." Given this, I want to ask the noble Baroness the Minister why the government appears to have had no plan in place to manage these developments, given that they should have been able to anticipate the need to intervene in order to keep the furnaces in operation. The actions taken by the government to secure the raw materials needed to keep the furnaces in operation are, of course, necessary, and this is the right course of action in the short term. But what this bill demonstrates is a complete and utter failure to act. This should never have been necessary in the first place. The mess we are in today is entirely of this government's making. If they had acted sooner, if they had negotiated better, then this entire debacle could have been avoided. My Lords, the Secretary of State in the other place said at the beginning of the second reading debate that the previous government did not have a deal in place with British Steel. However, on the 30th of April last year, British Steel was granted planning permission to build an electric arc furnace at its Scunthorpe plant and a further furnace at Teesside. This represented £1.25 billion of investment in modernising steel production. My Lords, the previous government were taking action to safeguard and improve Britain's steel industry. My Lords, as my noble friend Baroness Lang has said, the government believes that specific measures for post-legislative scrutiny and review were not needed for this bill. I'm afraid that this response is wholly inadequate. It cannot possibly be true that the government believes it unnecessary to include post-legislative scrutiny for a bill passed in one day, and for which noble lords had only had sight for 2 hours before our debate commenced. We understand the urgency required today, but that cannot come to the detriment of proper and effective scrutiny of these wide-ranging powers after the bill is passed. And to that end, my right honourable friend in the other place, the Shadow Secretary of State, tabled amendments to permit the Secretary of State to only be able to use the powers under Clause 2 for the period of 1 year, and to insert a sunset clause which would see the Act expire after either 1 year or 6 months after the issuing of a direction under Section 2. These amendments are crucial to ensure that the provisions in this bill are not open-ended powers. And I would urge the noble Baroness, the Minister, to consider placing reasonable time limits on this bill. My Lords, the experience of workers and communities affected by changes at Port Talbot demonstrates the importance of these decisions and how they are taken, to the thousands of people who are directly involved with the production of steel. And at this juncture, I would like to take the opportunity to take issue with the noble Baroness Lady Brinton, who said that the Conservatives failed to support Port Talbot. Well, in fact, it was the Conservative government that agreed the £500 million investment in electric arc furnace at Port Talbot, and millions more to support the workers and families. And this, of course, was adopted by this current government. And I might remind her that I represented the steelworkers and the community of Porthwall, but in the National Assembly for Wales for a number of years. And indeed, as a Member of Parliament, many of them were my constituents. Can the Noble Baroness, the Minister, please outline how the Government is engaging with the affected communities in both areas to provide support? Furthermore, can the Noble Baroness, the Minister, please confirm that she and her Government understand the importance of clarity and openness with communities as to their next steps in the medium and long term, and can she share these today? To that end, I think it is important to press the Noble Baroness, the Minister, on how long the Government intends to continue this intervention in the operation of the steelworks. Can the Noble Baroness, the Minister, also outline the discussions that the Government is having with commercial providers in their exploration of solutions which do not sign the taxpayer up to a sustained liability? Furthermore, what assessments have the Government made of the relative benefits and limitations of commercial solutions versus any proposed nationalisation? It is imperative to remember that the acquisition of an organisation also involves picking up the tab for how that organisation has been operating, and a full assessment of this needs to be performed as a matter of urgency if it has not already been completed. So can the Noble Baroness provide any information on the cost to maintain blast furnaces beyond the immediate short term? My Lords, it is vital that decisions we make in this matter are centred around supporting the national interest. It is important that the Government makes its choices pragmatically and responsibly. Can I therefore ask the Noble Baroness, the Minister, what, if any, role has been played by trade unions in negotiations over the future of Scunthorpe Steelworks? Can the Noble Baroness, the Minister, assure the House that the Government's next steps will be determined by the national interest and not by the unions? The events this week have affected the relationship between the UK and China, and I'm aware that the Chinese Government was yesterday actively attempting to transfer ownership of some raw materials to Jinjie. Can the Noble Baroness, the Minister, provide any updates to the House on talks the Government has held with the Chinese Government on this issue? And in addition to that, I want to ask if these events have led the Government to undertake a renewed assessment of the security and defence implications on our trading relations with China. And in closing, I think it is important to reiterate that what the Government is proposing today is a very short-term, temporary measure which will not provide a stable solution to the problems we face. In the interests of the affected communities and, most importantly, the taxpayer, the Government must take its next step sensibly, and we need to make sure that we do not see another panicked response like the one this weekend. And to that end, can the Noble Baroness, the Minister, please set out the next steps the Government is taking to support the operations of the Scunthorpe Steelworks in the medium and long term beyond the intervention that is being discussed today?
My Lords, I'd like to thank all noble lords, not just for participating in this debate, but for returning to this place in these exceptional circumstances. Before I respond to the comments that have been made, I want to reiterate the points made by the Prime Minister yesterday and by the Business Secretary in the other place today. The Government always said from the outset of our negotiations with Jinjie that we would keep every option on the table and that we would act in the national interest to protect British jobs. UK forged steel built our railways, our bridges and our buildings. It's an integral part of our economic future, and as it has been in our industrial past. That is why we need to pass this legislation today. And I'm therefore grateful to my noble friends Lord Reid, Lord Tunnicliffe, Lord West, Baroness Drake, Lord Faulkner, Lord Glassman, Viscount Hamwell, for reminding us how fundamental steel is to our infrastructure and our future economic growth plans. And I'd also like to thank the noble lady Baroness Redfern and my noble friend Baroness Ramsay, who reminded us of the human cost of the potential closure of that Scunthorpe site. And we reiterate our commitment to protecting jobs and communities impacted by that potential closure. My Lords, the Noble Lord Hunt and Lord Moylan complained about the urgency with which we've had to rush this legislation through, and I've got to say, I don't think they appreciated the urgency of the situation that we find ourselves in, where those blast furnaces were in danger of failing within days. That's why we're here today, and that's why this action was so necessary. And like the Noble Lord Fox, I'm not really inclined to take lessons from the party opposite about, given their record over the previous 14 years. In her year and a half as the Business and Trade Secretary, Kemi Badenoch met with UK steel companies on just 3 occasions. On their watch, the UK steel production plummeted by 4 million metric tonnes between 2010 to 2023, an eye-watering fall of 42% in manufacturing. The UK went from the 17th largest steel producer in the world to the 26th over that same period. And the economic output of UK steel halved to 2.3 billion in that time. And the Noble Lord Hunt was heralding the use of coal and the opportunities it would provide. I do have to remind him it was his party that closed the coal mines and made us reliant on imported coal in the first place. My Lords, the Noble Lord Moylan asked if we would be apologising. I have to say the government won't apologise for acting in the national interest. And as my right honourable friend said in the other place, this issue should have been resolved years ago. The situation we inherited across the board on assuming office is one where most of our foundation industries found themselves in difficulty. Since 2010, UK crude steel production has almost halved, and we know that rebuilding our steel industry after years of neglect will be a challenge. But it's one this government has grasped, and it's why today, where others have shied, we have stepped up to take action. My Lords, moving on to some of the points that have been made, the Noble Lady Baroness Brinton asked about the legal advice from the Attorney General. And I have to say it's the policy of the government not to discuss advice provided by the government. The Noble Lady Baroness Kofi asked about Teesside. Ultimately, British Steel have been responsible for commercial decisions regarding its location strategy, and the government was right to prioritise protecting as many jobs as possible during those negotiations. But it's not right to force job losses in Scunthorpe to benefit Teesside. But of course we want to do the best we can by Teesside communities, so government is continuing to work with the Tees Valley Combined Authority and local partners on regional investment and growth opportunities. The Noble Lord Fox asked about international law and our obligations, and I can assure him that everything we do is in compliance with our international law obligations under WTO and the GATT framework and international law more generally. And I can reassure him that we're entirely satisfied that these short-term powers are within the terms of our international law obligations. The Noble Lord Kerr and the Noble Baroness Brinton and others asked about compensation and whether compensation would be paid. We need compensation provisioned within the bill to preserve the investment climate and to comply with international standards. But the chances of compensation actually being recovered are very slim because the powers are there to protect the company's assets, not to damage them. Compensation would also have to be done via an SI, which would be subject to parliamentary scrutiny through the negative resolution. Baroness Brinton also asked about whether the powers in the bill were overreaching for the Secretary of State. The powers are linked to what a relevant person could have done, and basically the powers are to do anything that management are empowered to do, so it's within that confine that the powers are there. The Noble Lord Hunt, Baroness Brinton, Baroness Lang and other Noble Lords have asked about the Sunset Clause. My Lords, because of the speed at which the legislation has been drafted and the uncertainty of the situation, it was neither necessary nor appropriate to set a timeline on these specific interventions. The current international situation is unpredictable, so a fixed sunset clause wouldn't be workable or acceptable. We might have to come back to Parliament and do it all again. We can, of course, revoke directions at any time in relation to a particular steel company once the need for intervention has passed. We would welcome working with the Business and Trade Select Committee to make sure we work with members and to keep them updated so that these powers are not in place any longer than is absolutely necessary. And we understand the concern of the House about the use of these powers, and it's right that Parliament closely monitors this. So we will be updating the House every 4 weeks on the use of these powers.
I thank the noble Baroness, and I thank her for those words. I think what this House seeks is, rather than an update, is the opportunity to invoke these powers in a way that they appear to be intended. They have been called emergency powers, and the noble Baroness, the Minister herself, just called them short-term powers. So could the government, will the government, within 6 months of this bill coming into force, commit to having a substantive debate in both houses to determine whether the Act will continue, and will act on any resolution of the House of Commons on that further continuation of those powers?
Well, my Lords, I've been here a number of occasions answering questions on the situation with steel already, and we will continue to engage as widely as we have done in the future and to make sure that Parliament is updated on these matters. As I've said, we will update the House every 4 sitting weeks on the use of these powers, and I honestly think in these circumstances that's sufficient.
I'm very grateful to the noble lady, the Minister. The committee that she just spoke of, the Business and Trade Select Committee, of course, is a House of Commons committee. Within our own House, we have the Industry and Regulators Committee. And is it the government proposing that they would offer the same service, as it were, to our committee as well?
I thank the noble lord for raising that question, and of course, yes, I'm sure that we would be happy to consult with the relevant committees within your lordship's house as well. My lords, a number of noble lords, including Lord Hunt and others, asked about the cost of providing these safeguards. We are directing British Steel to act in a way which safeguards their assets, and this funding should be provided by the company. If the government needs to spend money, we will look to recover that from the company if we can and where reasonable. We've committed to up to 2.5 billion for steel via the National Wealth Fund and other routes, and no further government borrowing is envisaged to support any intervention. But I would also say to noble lords that the alternative would be importing steel at considerable extra cost to our economy. As noble lords have pointed out, we would also then be the only country in the G20 without domestic steel production. So there is a cost either way, and we have to balance those costs in the way that we make the decisions going forward. The noble Lord Seeker asked about what was happening in Port Talbot and why we're not nationalising British Steel in a response to that. My Lords, as I made clear in my opening comment, we are not nationalising anything. We have put forward a bill to ensure the continued safe operation of the blast furnaces. Without swift intervention, there was a risk of accelerated closure, jeopardising both safety and production outcomes of British Steel. Tata Steel made a decision to close the blast furnaces at Port Talbot in January 2024 under the previous government. The decision to provide a grant agreement towards Port Talbot's transition project was made by the previous government. And this transition was already well underway by the time we came into office. This is the point that the Noble Lord, Lord Davis made. However, I have to say to the House that we negotiated an improved deal with Tata after just 10 weeks in office, with better terms for workers, future investment opportunities for the area, and the highest voluntary redundancy package Tata has ever offered. And since then, we've provided more than £50 million directly into the local community from the £80 million available from UK government to help people learn new skills, to support the supply chain and to protect people's mental health. The Noble Lord, Lord Kerr and Baroness Jones and others asked about the end game for British Steel. My Lords, our long-term aspiration for British Steel remain a co-investment agreement with the private sector partner to secure a long-term transformation, and we are determined to see a bright and profitable future for UK steelmaking in this country. My Lords, a number of Noble Lords asked about energy prices and the cost of energy, and the government is committed to tackling high industrial prices in the UK. The British Industry Supercharger package of measures for energy-intensive industries comes into force in April 2024 and brings energy costs for strategically important UK industries, including steel, closer in line with other major economies around the world, so that they remain competitive on the world stage. Once fully implemented in April 2025, the measures will save eligible businesses on average 24 to 31 per milliwatt on their electricity costs. The total value of reduced electricity prices is estimated to be between 320 million and 410 million in 2025 and around 5.1 billion over 10 years. This will help to keep business costs, energy costs down. My Lords, just reiterating the point about scrutiny of the bill, regarding future scrutiny of the implementation of the bill, as the Secretary of State has said in the other place, we are happy to engage with relevant committees, and I'm happy to keep the House updated on these matters. We will continue to update the House every 4 sitting weeks on the use of these powers.
Can I just say to the Noble Baroness, the Minister, how grateful we are that she does understand the concern of the House about the use of these powers. And as I understand it, she has told the House that she will return every 4 weeks to update the House on the use of the powers. She was, however, intervened on by the Noble Lord Fox to suggest that she might go a little further than that and have a clear debate after 6 months. I still think this whole question of a sunset clause is very relevant indeed. And I wonder whether or not the Noble Baroness, the Minister, could expand on what she said earlier, that she believes a fixed sunset clause wouldn't be workable or acceptable. Why not? It is generally accepted in this House that powers of this nature should have a sunset clause. And could she perhaps expand and give a little more detail before we consider whether or not to table such an amendment?
Well, also, I thought I answered that point, that the bill as it stands here is to deal with one emergency, but as we know, the whole situation with that industry is a volatile sector, and we might need to use those powers at other times, but we will use them judiciously, with care, and as I keep saying, we will continue to update the House as to the use of those powers, but we don't feel in this particular bill that a sunset clause is necessary or desirable. And I would just say, just to clarify, I think my general comment was to the Noble Lord, that we would continue to engage with the Lords committees to make sure that they're fully updated with the progress going forward. My Lords, in concluding this debate, I would like to convey my thanks to all noble Lords for their thoughtful contributions and for helping us to pass this legislation so that we can retain that steel-making capacity in the UK for British workers' security, for British industry's future, and for the future for the workers of British Steel and their families. This is our priority, and that's how we intend to go forward.
She didn't respond to my specific question about ensuring that if there is any compensation paid under the terms of the bill, that would be absolutely clear and stated to the public and to Parliament what that amount is.
The noble lady is making a reasonable point, and I'm sure that we can accommodate that to make sure that that information is available.
And before the noble lady, the Minister, sits down, could I just point out that I did ask a number of questions, actually, which she has not answered. Perhaps if she could look at the record and write to me.
My apologies to the noble lord. He was speaking more quickly than I could write, but I will endeavour to respond to the points that I haven't been able to make so far.
Before the noble lady sits down again, I did make a specific point about whether or not nationalisation was one of those options on the table under review.
Can I make it clear that nothing is off the table and all of these options will be considered? But I also made it clear that this bill is not about nationalising steel. And if we do need to take any further steps, then obviously we will have to come back with further proposals to this House.
Minister, what opportunity is this House going to have to reflect on this bill?
Obviously, we've had a full debate today, and as I've said, that we will come back and report progress regularly to the House, including to the relevant committees of the House. So there will be plenty of opportunities to measure the implementation of the bill as we go forward.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Content. The contrary not content. The contents have it.
From the Commons that they have passed the Steel Industry Special Measures Bill, to which they desire the agreement of your Lordships.
My Lords, Steel Industry Special Measures Bill, I beg to move that this bill be now read a first time.
The question is that this bill be now read a first time. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Content. The contrary not content. The contents have it.
My Lords, I thought it would be useful to update the House on what will happen next. Now the bill has had its first reading, we'll adjourn the House for 15 minutes whilst it is printed and prepared for its second reading. That should be brief and formal in the light of this afternoon's debate. After second reading, the House will then be adjourned again for at least an hour to enable noble Lords to table any amendments for committee stage. The precise timings for committee stage will be advertised on the Annunciator when we can be more precise. With that, my Lords, I beg to move that the House will now adjourn in pleasure until 15:57. Oh, sorry, 14, sorry. Apologies, 14:57.
The question is that this House to now adjourn during pleasure. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Content. The contrary not content. The contents have it.